Part 1. Historical figures who were remarkably boring. A relaxing retrospective. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Tonight, we begin with something truly thrilling. The kind of story that will make your pillow feel extra inviting. Because tonight, we're not diving into battles, betrayals, or grand revolutions. No, we're drifting gently into the tepid, lukewarm waters of history's dullest human beings. Yes, the ones who were technically important, but emotionally about as engaging as damp parchment. This is a cozy journey through the lives of kings, queens, and nobles who managed to do absolutely nothing remarkable, and somehow history still remembered them. So, dim the lights, pour yourself something calming, maybe chamomile, or if you're feeling wild, lukewarm milk, and let's fall asleep together to the soothing sound of royal mediocrity. Let's start with a man who redefined the art of existing without incident. King Louis XVIII of France. Louis XVIII, the man who waited, and waited, and waited. Imagine being born into one of Europe's most powerful dynasties, and still ending up known as the guy who mostly, well, waited around. That was Louis XVIII. He was the younger brother of Louis XVI. Yes, the one who lost his head. So you might think Louis XVIII had a front row seat to some wild times. But no. When his brother got guillotined, Louis was already halfway across Europe, writing very polite letters to anyone who would read them. Louis spent most of his adult life doing, well, paperwork, and waiting for the French Revolution to blow over. Spoiler, it didn't for a while. He wandered from country to country, looking for someone, anyone, who would let him stay in their spare palace. Britain said fine, as long as he didn't touch politics. Which was fine because Louis didn't seem particularly interested in touching anything, politically or otherwise. He loved food, though, a lot. The man was described as corpulent, which is the 18th century historian's way of saying this guy definitely asked for seconds. His idea of royal action was choosing between pheasant or duck à l'orange. When Napoleon finally fell, Louis was put back on the throne mostly because no one else was available. And how did he rule? Gently, sleepily, like someone whose main policy was to avoid sweating. He even let people keep calling Napoleon the Emperor out of habit, because arguing would have required effort. His reign was so uneventful that French history books often skip over him entirely, like a nap between the two Napoleons. But in his own quiet way, Louis XVIII embodied something deeply human, the will to endure by doing nothing particularly interesting. Let's drift now from France's sleepy monarch to a man who somehow managed to make the Renaissance dull. Emperor Maximilian II, the forgettable Habsburg. The Habsburg family is famous for their jawlines, their cousins marrying cousins, and their knack for turning European politics into one big family reunion. But even among them, Maximilian II stood out, not because he was impressive, but because he wasn't. Born in 1527, Maximilian II inherited the Holy Roman Empire, which sounds grand until you remember the Holy Roman Empire was basically a messy group chat of German princes who never agreed on anything. While his father, Emperor Ferdinand I, spent his life arguing with Protestants and Ottomans, Maximilian mostly avoided confrontation. He was the kind of ruler who would nod a lot in meetings, write a few notes, and then quietly hope the problem solved itself. He did have interests. He loved botany and clockmaking, which, to be fair, are lovely hobbies if you're not running half of Europe. He collected exotic plants, tinkered with timepieces, and avoided wars. Historians sometimes describe this as pacifism. Others might call it being tired. He did have interests. He loved botany and clockmaking, which, to be fair, are lovely hobbies if you're not running half of Europe. He collected exotic plants, tinkered with timepieces, and avoided wars. Historians sometimes describe this as pacifism. Others might call it being tired. He died peacefully in 1576, leaving behind no grand legacy, no epic reforms, just a well-watered imperial garden and a clock collection that probably ticked more than his government did. Let's float onward from the middle of Europe to the north, to a place where kings were born cold, lived cold, and died of, well, probably boredom. King Frederick William II of Prussia, the romantic who forgot to rule. Frederick William II followed one of the most famous kings in European history, Frederick the Great. You might have heard of him. Brilliant general, philosopher, flute player. The man made Prussia into a powerhouse. So when his nephew, Frederick William II, took the throne in 1786, people hoped for a sequel. Instead, they got a soft, sentimental monarch who preferred opera to strategy. Frederick William was obsessed with mysticism and spiritual seances. Yes, the King of Prussia, commander of one of the most disciplined armies in Europe, spent his evenings talking to ghosts. He'd sit in darkened rooms with self-proclaimed prophets, waiting for messages from beyond. Sometimes he even based political decisions on what he thought the spirits advised, which might explain why Prussian foreign policy during his reign could be best described as random. He also loved the arts, mostly the romantic kind. He built lavish palaces filled with statues, music rooms, and paintings of angels. Meanwhile, his ministers handled the boring stuff, like the economy, which steadily declined. When Frederick William finally died, Prussian historians were baffled. One said he had all the means to be great, but preferred pleasure, which is just the 18th century version of he didn't do much, but he had a good time. Let's float onward to someone even less enthusiastic about power. Queen Anne of Great Britain, the sleepy sovereign. Queen Anne is one of those monarchs who technically presided over big historical events. The Union of England and Scotland, the War of Spanish Succession. But if you asked her about it, she'd probably just yawn. She became queen in 1702, mostly by accident. Everyone else ahead of her in the royal line had died or disqualified themselves by being too Catholic. So Anne, a shy, sickly woman who hated public speaking, became the face of the British Empire. Her reign was dominated by two things: chronic gout and passive-aggressive political feuds. She spent most of her time bedridden, writing letters to her friend Sarah Churchill, the original toxic bestie. Sarah was charming, ambitious, and very aware of her influence. The two women's friendship was basically a royal soap opera written in slow motion. Anne's main political strategy was to let her ministers argue while she knit quietly in the background. Sometimes she'd make a decision, but usually she just hoped the situation would go away. When she wasn't managing the drama, she was collecting porcelain, attending church, and trying not to die, which honestly was a full-time job given her health. By the time she passed in 1714, the British people felt mostly indifferent. The best thing said about her was that she hadn't ruined anything, which in
Part 2. The Gentle Art of Accomplishing Nothing. More remarkably boring royals. Welcome back, wanderer of the mildly interesting. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've made it through a journey that not even caffeine could make exciting. Tonight, we continue gliding through the lives of history's most powerful nappers, the men and women who ruled kingdoms, but somehow did so while radiating the energy of a lukewarm potato. Last time, we met Louis XVIII, Maximilian II, Frederick William II, and Queen Anne, each a shining example of royal underachievement. Tonight we'll drift into the lives of a few more, the emperors and kings whose main skill was existing quietly in the shadow of history's louder people. Let's start with one who could have done something, but chose not to. Emperor Franz I of Austria. Emperor Franz I of Austria, the man who married power and let her handle it. Now, technically speaking, Franz I wasn't boring on paper. He was the husband of Maria Theresa, one of Europe's most formidable rulers. She gave birth to 16 children, ran an empire, and still found time to lecture her ministers on morality. Franz, meanwhile, collected coins. No, really. His entire imperial hobby was numismatics, the study of coins. While Maria Theresa managed wars, reforms, and diplomacy, Franz sat in his study cataloging obscure currencies from long-dead duchies. When ambassadors came to court, they often had to sit through his long, enthusiastic speeches about rare silver thalers. Imagine being the representative of the Ottoman Empire, ready to discuss military borders, and instead spending 20 minutes learning about coin minting techniques in Saxony. He did occasionally attend meetings of state, mostly to nod. Maria Theresa trusted him deeply, but she also knew his talents were niche. So she made him Holy Roman Emperor, which was basically an honorary title by that point. Think of it like giving your husband a participation trophy for being supportive. Franz wasn't lazy. He just had no political ambition. He preferred gardening, astronomy, and quietly existing in Maria Theresa's gravitational pull. He died peacefully in 1765, surrounded by his coin collection, leaving behind a reign defined by stability and absolutely no excitement whatsoever. Let's drift forward a bit to one of his descendants, a man whose mediocrity arguably changed the course of history by accident, Emperor Ferdinand I of Austria. Let them handle it. Ferdinand was Franz's grandson, and he inherited not only the Habsburg jawline, but also their tradition of questionable genetics. Due to generations of inbreeding, Ferdinand was born with a frail body and frequent seizures. His tutors described him as sweet-natured and easily confused, which for an emperor is less than ideal. When he became emperor in 1835, his advisors quickly realized he wasn't exactly a hands-on ruler. Most government decisions were made by a council headed by his uncle. Franz's main interests were eating dumplings and trying to grow a beard. One story, possibly exaggerated but widely repeated, claims that during a peasant uprising Ferdinand shouted, "But are they allowed to do that?" which might be the most innocent reaction in the history of revolutions. When the 1848 revolution swept Europe, Ferdinand's ministers gently suggested he step down. He reportedly agreed immediately, saying, "Well, I can go now." And then he retired to Prague, where he lived another 20 years, peacefully, happily, and entirely outside the spotlight. He spent his later life tending his gardens, feeding ducks, and attending church. He once told a visitor, "I'm just glad it's someone else's problem now." It's hard to call him a failure, really. He ruled without war or scandal. He just didn't really rule. And maybe that's the dream, isn't it? Let's float south now, to sunny Spain, where another royal mastered the delicate craft of regal nothingness. King Charles IV of Spain, the sleepy spectator of his own reign. King Charles IV came to the Spanish throne in 1788, just in time for Europe's great wave of revolutions and wars. Unfortunately, he was the kind of man who could watch his palace catch fire and politely ask if someone else could handle it. He was tall, kind, and famously uninterested in politics. His wife, Maria Louisa of Parma, however, was not. She was loud, controlling, and entirely in charge, often through her favorite courtier, Manuel Godoy. Historians still debate whether Godoy was just a political advisor or Maria Louisa's lover. Either way, he was running Spain while Charles focused on hunting, clockmaking, and trying to avoid eye contact with Napoleon's diplomats. When Napoleon eventually decided to invade, Charles responded by abdicating. Not in protest, not in anger, just sort of relieved, like someone happy to clock out early from a stressful shift. After stepping down, he moved to Rome with his wife and Godoy, yes, all three of them, and lived quietly under papal protection. He spent his last years collecting clocks and doing some painting. The man who had lost an empire over dinner table gossip died peacefully, never seeming to understand what had actually happened. Spain went to war, kingdoms crumbled, and Charles IV just kept polishing his pocket watch. King George I of Great Britain, the reluctant Englishman. George I was technically a German prince who stumbled into the British throne by accident. In 1714, after Queen Anne's death, the British needed a Protestant monarch. So they looked through the family tree and found George, Elector of Hanover, a man who didn't speak English, had no interest in England, and once described London as a foggy place full of noise. He accepted the job anyway, probably for the paycheck. When he arrived in London, he brought his German friends, his German cooks, and his German mistresses. Parliament soon realized that George didn't actually care about ruling, so they took over most of the government work themselves. This, unintentionally, marked the beginning of Britain's modern parliamentary system. So yes, Britain owes its democratic balance partly to a man who couldn't be bothered to learn English. George spent most of his reign shuttling between London and Hanover, trying to avoid public appearances. He once got lost during a foggy boat trip on the Thames, and the newspapers mocked him for it for weeks. He died in his carriage on the way back to Hanover, still surrounded by German servants who probably had no idea what anyone in London was talking about. A foreign king who barely ruled, but who, by doing nothing, helped create one of the world's most stable governments. Sometimes the universe rewards minimal effort. King Chinston VII of Denmark, the royal who outsourced his personality. Christian VII ruled Denmark in the late 18th century, or rather, he was king while other people ruled Denmark.
He became monarch at age 17 and immediately developed a reputation for erratic behavior. Some historians believe he had schizophrenia or a severe anxiety disorder. Others simply described him as confused but cheerful. He enjoyed practical jokes, running through the palace hallways and punching courtiers in the stomach. For fun. His ministers quietly panicked. Eventually, his physician, a German doctor named Johann Strunzi, took control of the government. Strunzi was an Enlightenment thinker who introduced progressive reforms, abolishing torture, improving education, and modernizing administration. Christian Misemen, meanwhile, played with his dog and nodded vaguely when people mentioned policy. He reigned for 42 years. Denmark somehow survived. And so we see the pattern. Emperors, kings, and queens who reigned without flair, commanded without passion, and lived without urgency. They didn't conquer or destroy, they simply existed. And in a strange way, that might make them the most peaceful rulers of all. While their ambitious peers burned empires and spilled oceans of blood, these figures preferred their gardens, their clocks, their dumplings, and their naps. Maybe the lesson here isn't that they were boring, but that the rest of history was just a little too dramatic.
Part 3. The Royal Art of Being Mildly Alive. Europe's Quietest Monarchs. Welcome back, sleepless wanderer. If you're still with me, I can only assume you've achieved that perfect, cozy trance between consciousness and a nap. That's exactly where we want you. Tonight, we continue our long, meandering float through the forgotten corridors of royal dullness. Those marble hallways echoing with the faint sounds of yawns, teacups, and half-hearted policy discussions. In this part, we meet more of history's royal wallpaper, men and women so unremarkable that historians, bless their souls, had to dig through laundry bills just to find something to write about. Let's start in Russia, a land of ice, grandeur, and one of the most consistent examples of imperial blandness, Emperor Nicholas I. Emperor Nicholas I of Russia, the bureaucrat of boredom. Nicholas I reigned from 1825 to 1855, and his entire career could be summed up in one phrase: no fun allowed. He came to power accidentally. His older brother Constantine abdicated, leading to a brief confusion known as the Decembrist Revolt, where people literally didn't know who was in charge. Nicholas eventually stepped up, looked at the chaos around him, and said, "Right, we're never doing that again." From then on, he turned Russia into what could be best described as a giant paperwork machine. Everything, and I mean everything, required approval, stamping, and signature. He once demanded a report on how many reports were being written. Nicholas was deeply suspicious of free thought, laughter, and probably anyone who smiled too long. He ordered censorship of plays, books, and songs. Even ballets had to be screened for subversive themes, because, the Swan Queen might have opinions. He did have a sense of duty, though, a very, very dull one. He saw himself as the empire's chief policeman, which might be the least romantic self-description in royal history. Under him, Russia became a land of uniforms, reports, and sighs. His ministers dreaded meetings because Nicholas had the unnerving habit of reciting laws from memory entirely. When the Crimean War broke out, Russia's outdated system crumbled, and Nicholas, facing defeat, supposedly said, "I did not begin it, but I shall end it."
he promptly caught pneumonia and died. A very Nicholas way of resolving things. Even his funeral was efficient, solemn, and deeply boring. Let's drift from the icy bureaucracies of Russia to the sunlit, goat-filled hills of Greece, where a young monarch named Otto tried to rule the kingdom that didn't particularly want him. King Otto of Greece, the imported king who forgot to speak Greek. After the Greek War of Independence in the 1820s, the newly liberated nation needed a king. They looked around Europe and, for reasons still unclear, chose a teenage Bavarian prince named Otto. He was 19, German, Catholic, and spoke absolutely no Greek, which is, you'll agree, a bold resume for someone meant to rule Greece. When he arrived in Athens in 1833, the locals greeted him politely, but with mild confusion, like when a cat walks into your house and just stays. He immediately surrounded himself with Bavarian advisors, who decided Greece should look more like Munich. They built neoclassical buildings, introduced German bureaucracy, and banned several traditional Greek customs. The Greeks, understandably, were not thrilled. For years, Otto ruled as an absolute monarch, issuing decrees, holding parades, and trying to make Greece behave like a well-organized German duchy. The problem was, Greece had just spent a decade fighting against foreign control. Otto, bless him, never really got the hint. His main passions were architecture, punctuality, and his mustache. He was described as dignified, if not particularly animated. He'd stand for portraits like a statue that had slightly forgotten why it was there. In 1862, the Greeks politely overthrew him. They didn't even arrest him. They just told him it was time to go. Otto packed his bags, boarded a ship, and waved goodbye. He spent the rest of his life back in Bavaria, dressing in traditional Greek clothes for dinner parties and occasionally sighing about his beloved Athens. A man who ruled without understanding his people and lost everything without ever raising his voice. Let's drift now to France again, where royal dullness met revolutionary times in the form of Louis Philippe I, the Citizen King. Louis Philippe I came to the French throne in 1830, after yet another revolution. The people didn't want a glamorous monarch anymore. They wanted someone respectable, a safe choice. So they chose Louis Philippe, a man so middle class that he actually carried an umbrella and paid for his own furniture. He tried very hard to seem like one of the people. He dressed plainly, avoided pomp, and walked in public parks with a small escort. His portrait showed him in a dark suit, not royal robes, looking like someone's accountant. It was refreshing at first. People thought, finally, a humble monarch. But soon it just became awkward. He didn't attend balls, rarely gave speeches, and seemed perpetually uncomfortable being the center of attention. His reign became known as the bourgeois monarchy, a kingdom of bankers, laws, and beige respectability. The problem was, he was too normal. In trying to not be grand, he became forgettable. When another revolution broke out in 1848, because, well, it's France, Louis Philippe was asked to abdicate. He quietly signed a paper, disguised himself in a hat and coat, and left Paris on a train. Witnesses said he looked like an elderly tourist. He lived out his final years in England, reading newspapers, gardening, and occasionally muttering about how he'd done his best, which honestly he had, just not excitingly. Emperor Napoleon III, the emperor of mild ambition. Ah yes, Napoleon III, the nephew of the Napoleon. You'd think being named after one of the most dynamic men in history would push someone to greatness.
Instead, Napoleon III mostly achieved decent attendance. After several failed coups, he somehow became president of France in 1848, then crowned himself emperor a few years later, because apparently the first Napoleon hadn't caused enough confusion. He promised progress, order, and glory. What France got was a lot of public works projects, a few fancy railroads, and an emperor who spent more time on domestic decor than military planning. He adored modernity, urban redesigns, photography, and fashion. Under him, Paris got its wide boulevards and shiny parks. But when it came to foreign policy, his luck was not ideal. He went to war in Mexico, lost. Went to war with Prussia, lost harder. Then lost his entire empire in a single disastrous summer of 1870. Captured in battle, he reportedly told his guards, "Well, I suppose this is the end," which indeed it was. He spent his exile in England, doing gardening, visiting friends, and sighing softly whenever anyone mentioned the word empire. If Napoleon I was a thunderstorm, Napoleon III was a damp cloud passing by quietly. King Umberto I of Italy, the polite non-entity. When Italy finally unified in the 19th century, it needed someone regal enough to make people take the whole thing seriously. Enter King Umberto I, a man who looked perpetually confused about why he was there. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't brilliant, he was adequate. His advisors liked him because he signed whatever they gave him, and his people tolerated him because he mostly stayed out of the way. He did have one passion, the military. Unfortunately, this mostly involved attending parades and looking at uniforms. He was married to Queen Margherita, yes, the one the pizza is named after, which might be his most lasting legacy. When protests broke out in Milan in 1898, Umberto's general ordered troops to fire on civilians. The public blamed Umberto, but he responded by doing nothing. Literally nothing. He gave a medal to the general responsible, perhaps thinking it might make people...
Part 4. The Last Yawn of Empire. The Final Age of Majestic Mediocrity. Welcome back, weary traveler. You've made it to the end, the final stretch of our cozy expedition through the soft, cushiony underbelly of history. We've wandered through courts and palaces, sat beside kings who ruled by inertia, and watched empires quietly drift into the wallpaper. Now, as we approach the modern era, the 19th and early 20th centuries, royal dullness reaches its most polished form. Gone are the days of sword fights and intrigue. Now we have ribbon cuttings, banquets, and dignified yawns. Let's begin with a man who reigned in the shadow of a woman so powerful that even his mediocrity became charming. King Edward VII of Britain. King Edward VII, the playful procrastinator. Edward waited longer than any heir in British history, nearly 60 years for his turn to sit on the throne. By the time Queen Victoria finally passed away in 1901, Edward was 59 and already more of a professional dinner guest than a ruler. During his decades as Prince of Wales, he perfected the art of aristocratic leisure. He smoked 12 cigars a day, attended every horse race, and collected mistresses the way other men collected cufflinks. When he finally became king, people were surprised to find that he wasn't a total disaster. But that's because he didn't actually do much. He waved, hosted garden parties, and shook hands with diplomats. His most enduring achievement was making being British royalty look like a respectable hobby again. He was in essence the world's most charismatic placeholder. He didn't innovate, legislate, or revolutionize. He simply existed in a comfortable cloud of cigars and charm. His greatest political contribution? Acting as a kind of well-dressed social lubricant between rival European powers, most of whom were his relatives anyway. Edward VII died peacefully in 1910 after a cigar, a dinner, and what was probably a very pleasant nap. Tsar Alexander III of Russia, the mountain that didn't move. Before the storm of revolution came crashing down on Russia, there was Tsar Alexander III, a man who made being unyielding look almost relaxing. After his father was assassinated, Alexander decided that change was a bad idea. His reign became a long, quiet exercise in keeping everything exactly as it was, a kind of imperial deep freeze. He was enormous, over 6 feet tall and built like a bear, but famously gentle in private. He loved woodworking, reading, and long walks in silence. His idea of royal recreation was carving furniture. His ministers would beg him for reforms, and he'd simply stare at them until they stopped talking. He preferred domestic calm, and by domestic calm, I mean, please don't ask me to sign anything. He banned political movements, censored newspapers, and generally made sure Russia stayed quiet, right up until it exploded under his son, Nicholas II. His reign was described as peaceful stagnation, which honestly sounds like a very good bedtime phrase. He died in 1894, leaving behind a stable but fragile empire and a perfectly sanded set of handmade chairs. Emperor Wilhelm II of Germany, the loud one who still did nothing. Now, Wilhelm II might seem like a strange addition to this sleepy parade. He wanted to be exciting, the next Napoleon, the Kaiser of destiny. Unfortunately, he was also emotionally 15 years old for his entire life. He gave grand speeches, wore too many uniforms, and built a navy that mostly sat around looking impressive. He loved attention, but had the attention span of a ferret on caffeine. He dismissed advisors constantly, changed policies daily, and once said that he preferred to let Providence guide him, which was a nice way of saying, I don't really have a plan. Under his watch, Germany drifted toward World War I, not because of a bold vision, but because no one could convince him to stop talking. After the war, he fled to the Netherlands, where he spent his exile chopping wood, raising chickens, and complaining about modern architecture. He even tried to ban people from riding bicycles near his house because it upset the horses. He lived until 1941, completely irrelevant, a ghost from an age of crowns and ceremonies. Emperor Franz Joseph I of Austria, the eternal routine. Few monarchs represent the sheer endurance of royal blandness like Emperor Franz Joseph I. He reigned from 1848 to 1916, 68 years of consistent, punctual, methodical governance. Every day he woke up at exactly 4 in the morning, put on his uniform, and followed the same schedule to the minute. He ate the same breakfast, signed the same documents, and wore the same expression of polite disappointment. He wasn't cruel or foolish, just profoundly steady. His empire fell apart piece by piece around him, but he remained unmoved, like a well-ironed statue. His wife, Empress Elizabeth, Sissy, was romantic, rebellious, and fascinating. He, by contrast, was punctual. When their son died tragically, he simply continued his duties, signing documents through tears. He became a living symbol of continuity, a man who survived revolutions, wars, and the invention of the telephone without ever changing his morning routine. When he died, the empire collapsed within 2 years, as if it had been running purely on his quiet stubbornness. King Alfonso XIII of Spain, the man who smiled through a disaster. Alfonso was born a king, literally. His father had died before he was born, so the moment he entered the world, someone probably shouted, "Hail the baby!" He grew up charming, athletic, and very good at being photographed. Unfortunately, that's about where the skills ended. He presided over a Spain constantly on the edge of collapse, political chaos, military coups, and colonial losses. Through it all, Alfonso mostly smiled, attended polo matches, and tried to look reassuring. He once described himself as a king of good intentions and limited results. which might be the most self-aware royal quote in history. In 1931, after yet another crisis, Alfonso politely left Spain, saying, "I shall not make my people fight for me." He lived the rest of his life abroad, collecting art and pretending to still be busy. Spain became a republic. He became a footnote. King George V of Britain, the professional placeholder. King George V, the grandson of Queen Victoria, is the textbook example of functional dullness. He was not inspiring. He was not visionary, but he was steady, which in the early 20th century was exactly what Britain needed. He loved routine, disliked politics, and spent most of his life shooting birds and writing short, emotionless diary entries. When the Russian Revolution killed his cousin, Nicholas II, George refused to grant asylum, not out of cruelty, but out of bureaucratic neatness. He said, "It might cause trouble," as if talking about rescheduling a luncheon. He navigated World War I mostly by reading reports and frowning slightly. After the war, he rebranded the family name from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor because Saxe-Coburg-Gotha sounded a bit too German when you were bombing Germans.